Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's episode of Crypto in America. I'm Gerald Gallagher, and we are recording, if you didn't notice, live at the CoinDesk Live studio at Consensus. And we are joined by our guest today, Ari Redbord, Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. And we're super excited to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm incredibly excited to be here with you guys. As Ellie and I have talked over even the last month or so, it's just so cool that you guys have gotten together. It's really fun, I think, for people who have been around this space to see people that they've admired for a long time kind of get together and do something really special. So congratulations. It's absolutely awesome.
We always like to start off by asking our guests, what does crypto in America mean to you? Yes. So we've got to get your take.
I know you haven't been doing this very long, but I am a regular listener, so I definitely...
Oh, okay, so you were ready.
I'm anticipating the question. But I actually thought I'd tell a story around this. So I do these TRM run clubs all over the world. And Consensus has probably been the place where they've leaned into it the most. And we had about 65 people show up this morning in Toronto to run with me. We ran through the city, past the CN Tower and the Lakeshore. And it was this really incredible group of, there were regulators with us, there were policymakers, there were investigators, and we'll talk about sort of what we do, law enforcement. We had builders really from across the space. We had traditional financial institutions, right? Crypto businesses, we had Fidelity. That to me is what crypto in America is. It is like these really, really smart, thoughtful people coming together and building really transformative technology. So you always want to start with the tech when you're talking about what we're building, but I oftentimes start with the people that are building it, and it's probably been my favorite part of being a part of this space.
So I have to ask, did you have enough hats?
We totally had enough hats, but barely. As Gerald is a regular contributor to the TRM Run Club.
It's a great time.
And very fast
I was
for your audience out there.
Is he ahead of the pack? Or?
I try.
Yeah, he's usually winning these things, get the medal at the end, the whole show. No.
I told you last night, I will join that run club once I get back into running. I used to be a good runner back in the day.
I'll cheer on the run club.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it really is. It's like the running is like, almost secondary to the conversations I'm hearing out there. And even the connections people are making. It's like, hey, what are you building? Where are you doing it? And it's like, and when I think about crypto in America, it's very much like, I want this to be the place. Crypto is global, right? The nature of cryptocurrency is cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. But I'm an American. I worked in the U.S. federal government for almost 15 years. I want this to be the hub, the epicenter of what people are building. And it's fun to be with that group.
Have those conversations evolved in the last 6 months from, are you being sued, to what are you building? Is that something you've noticed?
Dramatically.
Okay.
I think that the conversation has completely shifted over the last 6 months. And I think in a couple ways, and I'm sure we'll dig into this. I mean, you are my go-to source on all things regulation. You know that. It's like
no pressure.
So if I need up-to-the-minute news, I go to you. So you can speak to these things. We talked about this on TRM Talks recently. But I'd say that the other thing that's really exciting is, I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I met with many of the largest financial institutions, and they're talking about custody. They're talking about issuing a stablecoin. And this is why you need clear regulatory frameworks, because it's important for, builders to know the rules of the road, but it's also important for these really large conservative financial institutions that I think are going to be really important players in the space to lean in. So I think the conversations have gotten much more real, from hey, this is something we should be thinking about as an institution, to this is something that we should be doing today. And I think that has to do with the better regulatory environment in terms of the conversations.
When you're having these conversations with banks, what are their main concerns? Is it when they're meeting with TRM Labs, right? You guys root out the bad guys. Is it mainly how do we avoid fraud? How do we avoid bad guys coming into the system? What are they saying to you? I think it's a couple different things. I think you certainly have that, hey, if we're going to do this, we want to make sure we're doing it in a compliant, safe, secure type of way, right? They read about all the hacks and the other types of sort of cyber activity that's happening in the space. It's always the bad headlines
and
in
they
crypto,
want to
right?
avoid that.
Everybody takes notice
famously so, for sure. And just I guess pausing for a moment, I am constantly talking about illicit finance within the crypto ecosystem. And I often sort of always come back to say, look, we're really talking about 1% of overall activity within crypto. We put out a report
1%.
About 1%.
That's it.
Okay,
that's pretty amazing.
So so any conversation, I always try to start with that. I'm on the main stage today talking about the Bybit hack. I'm going to start by saying, look, this is actually a relatively sort of small issue when you talk about overall activity. But that 1% is pretty existential when you think about North Korea, weapons proliferation, when you think about all these scams and pig butchering and other types of fraud where people are losing their life savings.
Right.
So like, I'm okay with 1%. I think that's a really great number, but I am still allowed to be super focused on that 1% to try to even get it down from there.
Yeah, so Ari, I'm curious, in the context of what you guys do at TRM and security and how those institutions want to work with you, as an individual, I'm like, my keys, my coins, right? I'm good. Like, what other security do I need? What do you guys actually do to implement like safeguards? How do you guys make institutions feel comfortable? And like, tell us a bit more about what you guys are actually doing on the ground.
No, I really appreciate that. So a couple different things. We work with a number of different clients across the ecosystem. So every U.S. federal law enforcement agency uses TRM today. They're using our software, they're using our data. And what they're doing is they're building investigations. They're tracking and tracing illicit proceeds, whether it's from a ransomware attack, right? They're using TRM to track and trace the payment. Is it from a hack, right? They're tracking and tracing those funds leaving Bybit or leaving the Ronin Bridge, ultimately to build an investigation. They're following scam proceeds, right? And that's sort of the fancy graphs that you see us put out everywhere, right? Like, this is what this looks like within the tool. But then you talk about financial institutions or crypto businesses. The largest in the world are all using us as a compliance solution. They want to make sure bad actors are not engaging with their platform. They want to make sure they're not sending funds to a scam address, to an address associated with terrorist financing. And we're building this enormous database of fraud and financial crime to allow investigators to investigate, but also compliance teams to stop bad actors. The other sort of interesting wrinkle, and this is very much your world, is that regulators use us today. So think SEC, CFTC, US Treasury, but then globally. And they want to understand, what are the risks within our regulated ecosystem? Are you getting a license, right? Eventually, we're going to have a federal licensing regime in the US. We don't have that today. They have that in Singapore and Dubai and all over the world. But New York has that today, right? So New York is using, tools to for licensing determinations and ultimately supervision. So it's an important piece to all of this. But I think it's just what I tell people all the time. You talk about the crypto headlines being all bad. The reality is that like crypto builders, people building the space, want to keep bad actors off of their platforms and are even if you don't care deeply about the national security things that I've spent my career working on, you care about the ecosystem. And if North Korea can steal, funds at unprecedented speed and scale, the system, people aren't going to put those funds on that DeFi protocol, on that exchange. So that's why I'm 24/7 with this stuff. We want to keep this ecosystem safe.
Do you think that the scams and hacks are increasing during this current market cycle, or have you seen them kind of alleviate compared to previous ones in like 2022 and 2021?
It's a really great question. I don't know that there's a really close correlation between illicit activity and the market. We certainly see, bad actors being able to steal more money when Bitcoin is sort of, higher value. We do see a lot more scam activity, but we've also gotten a lot better. We run a website at TRM called Chain Abuse, and Chain Abuse is the largest reporting database for fraud and scams in crypto. We've had 1 million plus reports, right? But what's cool about it is you can go on there and say, hey, I'm about to send funds to this. Is this a scam? Law enforcement uses it for lead generation. So like, we've seen VASPs, cryptocurrency businesses, exchanges get a lot better at compliance too. I would say, over the last couple of years, we've only seen the percentage of illicit activity in crypto decline. But we're still seeing, look, North Korea stole $1.5 billion from, the Bybit exchange a few months ago. We put out a report that they said they stole about 800 million last year. Right. So one major hack can completely skew these numbers. And that's really where our focus is. How do we stop that from happening in the first place? How do we seize back those funds for victims?
So today's episode is at Consensus, but we're recording next week's live at the Avalanche Summit.
If you want a sneak peek at our live onstage recording with the Ava Labs CEO, Emin Günsir, you can check it out.
Or want to see other great panels, check out the live stream at avalanchesummitlondon.com.
See you there.
See you there. How do you square that if you were to testify in front of Congress, in front of the Senate Banking Committee, and Elizabeth Warren asked you, well, all of crypto is a scam. They're all stealing money and laundering money.
Yeah.
What would you say in response to, well, the Bybit hack did just happen, but really it's only 1%?
Yeah, it's a great question. And And what I would also tell her is that we're laser focused on that 1%, like I told you, and so are the businesses that we work with. And it's not just the centralized space. The leading DeFi protocols are all using tools in order to ensure they're not sending funds to sanctioned actors or engaging with sanctioned actors, that they're not engaging with terrorist financiers. So the ecosystem is very much doing that. I've testified twice before House Financial Services on this exact issue. And, I always start with the promise of crypto is this idea of cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet, right? You can now send larger amounts of funds faster than you ever could before. That is great for remittances, for humanitarian aid, for payments, right? But it's also great for bad actors who now want to move larger amounts of funds faster than ever before. But the difference between crypto and the traditional financial system, when I was a prosecutor, I spent about 11 years as a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and I investigated cases involving networks of shell companies and hawalas and high-value art and diamonds and real estate. There was no TRM to track those things. You talk about the opaque corners of shadiness.
Yeah,
that is where people move funds. Bulk cash smuggling, right? You see people move suitcases filled with cash. So what I would say to Elizabeth Warren or anyone else is that we have visibility over these transactions in ways we just never did in the traditional world, and can track and trace the flow of funds on an open public ledger. And that allows us to actually do compliance and investigations better than we ever could in the traditional world.
So let's talk a little bit about, I want to get to the regulation that we have going forward, the way the crypto industry is going to be regulated. You just mentioned your time in Treasury. Let's talk about what is the regime now? I mean, in a sort of post 9/11 world, we're talking about Bank Secrecy Act, right? We're talking about money transmission. What are the current laws that, these companies, these clients are worried about, in the existing structure?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'd start with, I think there is this really interesting conversation going on right now, and it's been going on for maybe 2 to 3 years now in the crypto space. I think the original Tornado Cash sanctions in August 2022, is that right, or 21, started this conversation. And you mentioned post 9/11, that's when I really started as a prosecutor. And that conversation was on city streets and in airports, right? What amount of privacy are you willing to give up for security? And now we're having that conversation in the digital space.
Right.
And I think it's a really, really important conversation. But right now, in terms of regulation, and even the legislation that's pending, whether it's stablecoins or market structure, it's about the centralized space. And, people talk about crypto famously as the Wild West, or there's no legal clarity. And that's true when you're talking about, is it a security? Is it a commodity? Sort of the questions that you grapple with all the time. I have the benefit of actually having relative clarity on these issues in the anti-money laundering space. And that is, if you are a crypto business, right? If you're an exchange, if you're a broker, if you're a custodian, you are a money service business for purposes of FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is part of the U.S. Treasury. They're the financial intelligence unit, the anti-money laundering regulator. And what they say is that you have to have compliance controls in place, right? You have to have policies and procedures. You have to use tools like TRM. You have to respond to law enforcement subpoena. So I say all that to say, the BSA regime that exists, the Bank Secrecy Act, which is the U.S. money laundering statute, exists today and is already required of the centralized space. There's all kinds of really interesting questions around what this means for DeFi, and maybe for another day, certainly for another Congress, in terms of where they'll try to figure this out. But I think the reality is that centralized crypto businesses have these obligations today, and I think have very much leaned into them, right? They're hey, we own that. We have compliance teams. I mean, I did a panel a couple months ago with a compliance officer from Coinbase, and she described, it was an audience of banks, right? Compliance professionals at banks. And she described what, in my mind, was a more robust compliance program than any of the banks sitting there in the room had.
Wow.
In fact, I asked the crowd, it's are you surprised to hear that from a crypto business? Raise your hand. Every one of them had raised their hand. So I think these businesses are doing a good job. There are gaps in jurisdictions that don't have controls. Russia is a great example. Another a bunch of other sort of offshore entities. But you talk about crypto in America, they're doing a really good job with compliance today.
We are.
Yeah, I actually have a bit of a hot take follow up here.
Please.
So I want to know there's concepts in law school where the system is designed around maximizing sort of the greater good and not sacrificing individual benefits. Do you think I guess there's been some talk about whether or not the BSA went too far?
Yep.
Do you think, and we see a lot of sort of TradFi, money laundering, even under the rules that we have now, is it working?
Yeah. No, hot take for sure. Well, actually, that was a question. Like, I'm sure you have a hot take that
I
comes
need
out
your
of that
hot take.
question.
I need your hot take.
Then Gerald will share his.
Yeah.
Look, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions around the BSA. If you actually, this is maybe like getting a little bit ahead of us, but what you've seen from the Trump administration is a bunch of different guidance, letters, kind of proclamations from SEC, CFTC, Treasury, and DOJ. And what they're really saying is like, we want to be smarter about the way we regulate and enforce regulation. And I think some of it goes to your question. And that is like, the BSA feels to a lot of businesses, and this is not a crypto issue, this is any financial institution issue, it feels like boiling the ocean. Like, we're supposed to look at every possible thing. And what they all have done is basically they file these SARs, suspicious activity reports, on just about anything and everything. And I was a prosecutor, and I was on one of these SAR task forces where we were supposed to look through piles of SARs trying to find a needle in a haystack. And I think my view of the BSA is that like there's a lot of very good in the BSA, and we have to stop money laundering, right? I mean, this goes back to the cartels of the 80s in terms of drug cases and all the money laundering that was going on with a lot of the issues, quite frankly, the Trump administration is focused again on today is how to stop these guys from laundering the proceeds. But I think there's a lot of good in the BSA, but I think that we have to be a lot more focused and targeted on where we do risk management and compliance. You talk about a risk-based approach when you talk about implementing the BSA. And what that means should be the actual risks that are out there, not sort of this boiling the ocean type of stuff. So I think that like, hopefully that's a semi-decent hot take on your question. And that is like, I think actually we need to modernize it. We need to make it a lot more targeted. But I do think there's a lot of good that still is in there, at least in the sort of the way was originally formulated.
Talk about boiling the ocean or like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. We saw the DOJ recently roll back some guidance that, frankly, a lot of anti-crypto folks, a lot of anti-Trump folks weren't happy about because on the face of it, it seemed, crypto has this sort of free reign and they're not going to go after bad actors anymore, which actually wasn't the case. It was just, we're actually not going to go blanket after these DeFi software developers, right? We're going to focus on bad actors and we're going to focus on the scams in the space. I mean, was that something that you at TRM were encouraged by? Is that something that you were surprised by?
Yeah, no, I think you kind of like wrapped my answer to the question into your question. Well, you're very good at this. It's great. I could ask you the same thing. Look, I'm always looking at all of this very, very carefully. And I mentioned it wasn't just DOJ, it was Treasury and SEC and CFTC. And it's really like what you're starting to see is a consistent view across the administration. And I'll dig into the DOJ specifically in a second. But I think what you see is like, hey, we want to move away from regulatory enforcement against otherwise lawful crypto businesses that just need rules of the road, right? Like, how can you go after a business for registering or for unregistered securities when they don't know whether what they're registering is a security or not?
Right.
And I think that like at a high level, that's what the administration is saying. We're going to, at least for now, move away from regulatory enforcement against lawful crypto businesses, Coinbase, Ripple, OpenSea, all the ones, Uniswap, and we're going to focus on bad actors. And for me, as long as the focus continues to be on bad actors, then I think that's exactly where we need to be. So in every one of those, proclamations, guidance, letters, it was exactly said, we're going to move people from enforcing on lawful businesses to focusing on, CFTC said this explicitly, to fraud, which is like literally a mandate for the CFTC, for the SEC, securities fraud, right? And DOJ said, I think they even named terrorist financiers, ransomware, darknet market. I mean, these are my categories, but like darknet markets and truly bad actors. So I think that's what's happening. Just like real quickly on the DOJ part, I worked really closely over the years with many of the trial attorneys who ended up on the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. There was no National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team when I was at DOJ, but these are really some of the best prosecutors in the world, and they're really good at their job, and they're absolute experts. And in my mind, as long as they go back to their respective sections, whether it's fraud, whether it's the money laundering and asset forfeiture section, whether it's the computer crime section, or national security, and go after real bad actors. And that's exactly like what should probably be happening. And from what I hear from folks, that is the mandate, at this point. But I think that like it's a little too early to know, like, are we going to keep doing this? But I will tell you, if it's any indication, I even saw a case come out this morning, a pretty significant crypto case out of the District of DC. They are going after real bad actors. And I think we'll continue to see that.
Do you think the regulation by enforcement era during the last administration was fairly put? Or as someone who was in the DOJ and then, left and went to TRM Labs, how do you kind of look at that, and were you upset with it, or did you think it was fair at the time?
I don't think it's fair. I think that like these regulators are also put in a really difficult position where, like, if you're a regulator, you have authorities and you're supposed to be using those authorities. I do think that like it's a lot easier for, I was very lucky. I was at DOJ and I was at Treasury, where it's actually pretty clear what we were supposed to be doing, and that is going after actual bad guys. And I worked in the I originally worked in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and left at the end of that administration.
Which one was your favorite?
You know what you have to say, right?
People would kill me if I said this, but my favorite U.S. attorney I ever worked for was an extraordinary woman named Jessie Liu, and she was Trump's appointee in D.C. in the first Trump administration. And I would say that, like, when I think about the people who were really focused on going after bad actors and giving us the authorities we needed and the real push and support to go after bad actors, like, that was definitely great U.S. attorneys across the board. But she was the one that I think of. She's a partner at Skadden now and still doing a lot of like cool stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk about the role of regulators here, right? Because we're moving into what's happening now. We obviously really appreciate the efforts of the crypto task force you mentioned. We're getting a lot of I guess proper sort of scope from a lot of these regulatory agencies now under this administration. And the worry, of course, from a regulatory clarity standpoint, is that the pendulum can swing, right?
Totally.
So you have Gensler kind of vastly expand the mandate, and he's showing up on CNBC doing enforcement actions, and I guess that's great. That we have this clarity now, but what's the difference between getting sort of regulatory certainty versus judicial certainty versus legislative certainty? Like, what should we be prioritizing as an industry for that clarity on a long-term basis?
Awesome. So his role in this podcast is to ask like the really like good legal questions.
Oh, he's our legal brain.
He is our legal in-house legal, not legal advice.
You always need a lawyer. Yeah, this is not legal advice.
He's a lawyer, but not yours.
Yeah,
exactly.
Lawyer, not your lawyer. Yeah, I think that's why we need legislation. We have to codify the current environment to the extent possible. And what I do think that, like, I don't like the term permissive, because I don't think regulators should be permissive to fraudsters and scammers and things. I've heard that term thrown around. I want to say I like thoughtful, like trying to craft legislation or regulation in a way that stops bad actors and allows lawful users, and then allows this sort of ecosystem to grow. But I would say, like, we have this thoughtful regulatory environment right now, and which gives us a little bit more time. So there's no more time on stablecoins. Like, please, Ellie, tell me they're going to do this. Like,
we'll see.
Okay, but there is
a lot of tired faces in DC yesterday. A lot of tired faces.
Just follow her on X and you're fine. But I do think there's a little time on market structure right now. Like, it's early. I do think they're going to have to figure out where the SEC and CFTC, and I'm not sure like what was decided a few years ago in a different environment is like necessarily where we're going to land. But I would say that what you're describing just gives us a little bit more time for that. But we absolutely in the next 2 years need to codify what like legal clarity will look like for the space, because I think we're more and more pulling regulators back from being able to interpret statutes broadly, right? And that means we need Congress to be more clear.
Yeah.
Maybe now we want regulators to have a little bit more leeway, but that's the problem of like our 4-year cycles,
Chevron
right?
for me, but not for me, right? Yeah.
And I will say I really hate that, right? Like, to me, we're a country that has lasted hundreds of years. We're going to last hundreds of more years, and it's because we have a system of checks and balances. This is something that belongs in the legislative branch, and in part because we have changes every 4 years, whether we need them or not, and we have to make sure that we have some guardrails around that.
I want to ask you a question, and it might sound really silly, but I think it's important to define what is a bad actor. Because I think there are people in this industry who think they're operating in a way that is lawful and or not malicious, but they are actually bad actors.
Great point.
And then, of course, there's the obvious bad actors that we know and don't love. But how would you define it?
I love that question.
Great question.
I use the term a lot, and maybe I don't define it enough. I use bad actors, I use illicit actors, I use threat actors. It's like very
They're
much
all
like
actors.
these are the
Yeah.
national security. Yes. Well,
But they're not the stage
and we only have
actors,
one
Not
actor.
stage actors. Yeah.
So I'm so distracted by that interaction right now. No, so I would say, look, I think there's a spectrum of bad actors. I'm very lucky in that I get to focus on the very worst of them. It's like when you ask me like what keeps me up at night, it's like North Korea's cyber criminals. It's ransomware attacks. It's child sexual abuse vendors who are accepting cryptocurrencies. I think it's the very, very worst of the worst. It's the category that you said we all know who they are. It's like
Right.
we all know who they are. I think there is there is another group, and that is something I think you see regulators really focused on. We met with the SEC task force a few weeks ago, and it was a great conversation, and it was very different than probably what they're having with a lot of other folks, where they're talking about, hey, help us define a security, help us define where's the distinction, for us it was very much like, hey, how do we stop market abuse, right? You're going to be regulating crypto markets, securities markets, and I think we see a lot of folks who are taking advantage in maybe not like a truly illicit way right now, but manipulating the market, whether it's these meme coin launches, whether it's other wash trading, stuff that is criminal. I mean, a lot of this is wire fraud, but a lot of it is a little bit in that ambiguous way. If I had to, it's interesting. I've never really defined it, but if I had to, it's like, people who are attacking the ecosystem, and there's some very clear ones, and there's some ones that are sort of less clear today. The reality is that we're seeing a lot of bad actors who are looking to crypto to launder funds. And you even see money laundering as a service now, right? Folks who are just out there who are, taking funds from a hack, taking funds from ransomware, working with networks of these pig butchering scams, working with cartels, right? Cartels, are using crypto really only because they're working with sort of money laundering as a service organizations that are helping them launder funds.
Why do that?
I don't even know if that was a good explanation, but
No, it was good.
yeah,
It was
it's
great.
a spectrum.
Yeah.
Why do that though when the blockchain is transparent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think because you can move larger amounts of funds faster
Quicker,
using
yeah.
crypto,
Got
and
it.
it really depends on who you're kind of dealing with, right? I was on this Netflix documentary called "The Biggest Heist Ever."
Oh wow, casual.
Which is no big deal. And it was actually a really wild experience. It was the director and the team behind Tiger King and 100 Foot Wave
gosh,
and Firefest. It was really a surreal type of experience. But that is the story of the Bitfinex hack and this really colorful couple, Razel Khan and thing.
Yeah.
And I bring it up because they had a very different MO than most cyber criminals that we deal with, because they didn't want to get caught. So you ask about the transparent nature of blockchains. It was literally like this. You talk about Les Miserables. It was Javert and Jean Valjean tracking funds across blockchains over years, and different obfuscation techniques. And they're hiding in darknet markets and using mixers and privacy coins. And they were doing everything they could to not get caught. Why? Well, we found out because they were sitting there in New York City and could get arrested, which they ultimately did. North Korea is very different. So they know that the blockchain is transparent. And they're just trying to move funds as fast as they can to off-ramps to use them. And when we are able to work with law enforcement to seize back funds, however much that is, they just see that as the cost of doing business. So I think that's the paradox of crypto. And I think that it's a little disingenuous, and I've been guilty of this. I've been out there all the time saying hey, bad guys should never use crypto because we see every transaction. And that's true, but the reality is they can also move funds faster and in larger amounts. And that's why we have to just get better and better at what we're doing.
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
let's talk a little bit about why we know who they are.
Yeah.
Right? Because you and I have had this conversation before about you can go on chain all day,
Yeah.
right? And you can do a lot of tracking and tracing, and I can say this wallet's connected to that wallet. There's some great sleuths out there, some great sleuths, with you guys. But it seems like interaction with on and off ramps, sort of interaction with the traditional financial system, is where a lot of these people make mistakes. Is that kind of how you guys?
No, you nailed it.
Yeah.
I think there's just parsing that a little bit. It's fun. I'd say that Gerald and I Gerald and I run together, I get my privacy maxi fix. But it's I really do, because he always asks these really good questions around kind of what we do. And I think one thing that's always really important to explain is that we do not associate alphanumeric addresses, crypto addresses, with individuals. So I don't say hey, that's Ellie's crypto address, right? We associate them with threat categories, all the ones I've mentioned, ransomware, North Korea, darknet markets, and we associate them with entities. So we say, hey, that belongs to Coinbase. We know that belongs to Uniswap. That belongs to Binance. The only way that law enforcement can connect Ellie to her address is if they go to that cryptocurrency exchange and they get her KYC.
Right.
We do not have that, right? Like we are literally entirely on chain. But that also means that we lose visibility when funds go off chain. So we lose visibility when funds go to an exchange. We lose visibility when funds go to a network of Chinese OTC brokers
So the
that are
exchanges
being
don't
used.
work with you then?
They do. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But then they know that information, right?
Okay.
So we're able to see, hey, this is an omnibus wallet that belongs to a cryptocurrency exchange, and here's all the funds in there, right? That's still because that's on chain. But exchanges have order book data just on their platforms.
It reminds me of the election campaign finances, right? Like we couldn't track the funds going through the exchanges to super PACs and Trump, but we could track them through the on-chain
100%,
donations,
yeah.
right?
When I often explain this, a lot of it is like, hey, blockchain analytics like TRM, it's not a silver bullet. We're amazing. I mean, to all of your questions around visibility on blockchains, we're amazing at tracing transactions, and we're better than we've ever been at it, right? Tracing through mixers and in privacy coins and different types of things. But the reality is that like law enforcement, national security agencies need to use other tools when you're really going after the bad guys. And my view has always been you have to go after North Korea by like actually going after North Korea, not going after crypto businesses.
Yep.
And I think we're seeing more of a focus on that. Chinese money laundering organizations are used to launder funds from North Korea hacks, from cartels, from pig butchering scams. We need to go after those networks.
Can you define
and that's not on chain.
Pig butchering scam for our listeners?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's a really terrible term, and different people have a different view of whether to use it or not. I do use it because I think it does shock the conscience a little bit and like gets people thinking about it because it's really awful. Basically, what one of these scammers will do, it's like every one of you have gotten one of these text messages probably this morning. Hey, hey, baby, like, want to golf today? I get sometimes like, what? I don't golf. But it's like they're trying to start a conversation with you. They want you to say like, who is this, right? And then ultimately they build a relationship, sometimes romantic, and it ultimately over time will end in a crypto investment scam.
Right.
They'll say, hey, I don't know if I made a lot of money, like I'm doing really well with this thing, and ultimately the victim will send that scammer funds. And oftentimes there's websites, sometimes that look like Coinbase, right? Coinbase is spoofed, Binance is spoofed, all the time, and they'll send funds. Oftentimes the scammer will then send more funds back because ultimately they want to show a return. So you send more.
It's the cost of doing business.
But you're going to get it back in spades.
Yeah. Right.
And ultimately the reason that the sort of pig butchering, which comes from a Chinese term, is because you're fattening up the pig.
Yeah.
Ultimately to butcher it. And it's really like an epidemic. It's one of the saddest things. There's a former prosecutor from Santa Clara, California named Aaron West, who I think is like one of the leading spokesmen for victims in this space. But it is one of the saddest things when people realize that they have been scammed. The FBI, we've worked with the FBI for about a year or so on an operation that they call Operation Level Up. And what they've been doing is literally going door to door to warn victims that they are going to be a potential victim of one of these cases. And why do they go door to door? Because when they call on the phone, people don't believe that it's true. When a crypto exchange reaches out or a bank reaches out, they don't believe it. Well, I love this person. This person loves me. I know them. It's like, well, you don't. But like that doesn't scale. The FBI knocking on people's doors, warning them doesn't scale. So I think education, so I'm always like psyched to get to talk about this because I think that you have to educate people. Just don't engage with that in the first place. Like swipe, delete, block.
It's
don't.
crazy. I get people messaging me on Twitter quite a bit saying, hey, are you messaging me from another account asking me about how to trade well or, sign up to your crypto investing platform? And I said, no. And I have to literally put this is my only X account in my Twitter bio. And sometimes people ignore that and they copy it and it happens every single day.
I mean, I'm sure you see it's really, and like the one thing you really hate, I get all the time, like I have a colleague, Christian Chesky, who's one of the leading crypto investigators in the world. He leads our global investigations team. And recently someone sent an email with our names in it saying like, basically pretending to be us. But it was like, felt fairly legit. Like, let us help you.
Yeah.
And we were asking for like $5,000 or $10,000 to help recover funds.
Oh.
Yeah.
And I put a thing out on Twitter or LinkedIn and said, hey, we don't do this.
Yeah.
I would certainly never ask for your money. Like, it's just, but then like when you feel like you somehow had a part in it, it's
Feel
like
awful.
the most heartbroken. People are losing their life savings this way.
Yeah.
But again, like you talk about how do we do this? We have to go after the scammers and the fraudsters, and we have to go after the countries that are allowing them to do this, not after the crypto businesses that are like just part of like the story here. Yeah.
So that's it's a great point because you are the global head of policy, right? And we're talking about going door to door with the FBI in the United States, what we can do to crack down on that here.
Yeah.
But as you point out, like we can know that it's coming out of North Korea. North Korea seems to have turned this into an enterprise. They're not going to shut this down anytime soon.
Yeah.
How are other countries dealing with this? Like, is there as much of an emphasis on stopping this, or is it sort of just a part of the system? Like, what are you seeing globally?
I think from a scam perspective, it's very much like a lot of this is happening in the developing world. So in India, in Southeast Asia, you talk about Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. These are countries where they have these giant scam compounds where people are literally being human trafficked and forced to send these messages. So
I've heard this.
It's it's you go look at these things. I mean, it's pretty evident what they are. There are bars on the windows. I mean, they're really, really horrible stuff. Again, I mentioned Erin West earlier. She's gone over there and has like tweeted, put videos out there of like actually seeing these places. So the victims are really mostly in the West. I was talking to folks in Singapore and Korea and Japan recently, and they're also seeing a lot of this activity, right? So, but I certainly say that the developed world is really the target of this thing. And in order to actually stop it, we have to go after like the infrastructure that's enabling it.
Right.
So go after the gangs that are doing the human trafficking, go after the money laundering organizations, because we're not going to do this by like, look, we're a blockchain intelligence company. I love to trace everything. We're not going to trace our way out of this thing. It has to be education and going after the infrastructure.
How frequently do you find that if you are a victim of these scams, that these people actually get their money back?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hard.
Yeah.
I think the reality is really, really hard. Like every week I put something on our website that talks about like, how law enforcement use blockchain intelligence to ultimately investigate and seize back funds. So I'm always looking for like these examples. It's a real challenge. I think the reality is like cyber criminals are moving very, very quickly. They're moving to exchanges where they're off-ramping the funds. I think that cryptocurrency exchanges, law enforcement, really need to continue to get better and better at this. And I think this is going to be important even for legislation, right? Stablecoin issuers have capabilities in order to burn and reissue funds to victims. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that happening. We have a partnership with Tron and Tether called T3, where we have worked with law enforcement to seize back, over 200 million in the 7 or 8 months that this has been operational. Many of them have been in the pig butchering scams, and it's because a centralized service like Tether has the ability to freeze assets and then ultimately reissue them to victims. But it's a real challenge, and I don't want to whitewash sort of like the wins there. I think sadly I say I'm so sorry to a victim more often than I get to say like, hey, we were able to work with law enforcement to seize back funds.
Yeah, it's so tough. Can you talk about Treasury's role in what could be upcoming legislation? I feel like we have a lot of focus on the SEC and the CFTC when it comes to crypto, right?
Yeah.
Treasury is actually holding roundtables with industry this week, which I reported on Monday. How do you see the Treasury being involved going forward?
Sure. I am here, so I couldn't be there, but TRM will be at a roundtable this week with
I figured.
with Treasury because they're really focused on these issues. And one of the reasons I was very proud to work for Treasury in the first Trump administration, and like really proud of the subject matter experts that are there now, are I think they're really like doing the right things, and that is like going after the real bad actors within the ecosystem. And I know that like there's obviously a lot of conversation around sanctions and the role of sanctions and IEPA and Tornado Cash. But the overwhelming majority of sanctions actions that OFAC has taken over the last 3, 4, 5 years have been going after what I would consider to be like the illicit underbelly of the lawful crypto ecosystem. So they've done sanctions against darknet markets. They've done sanctions against, quite frankly, darknet mixing services, Helix and Bitcoin Fog, that are like not Tornado Cash. They're not lawful users on these platforms, right? They're created in order to launder Bitcoin for criminals. They've gone after non-compliant cryptocurrency exchanges. The largest in the world was Garantex until global law enforcement took them down a month, or I don't know. My time in crypto is very difficult to, but maybe a month or 6 weeks ago. But prior to that, OFAC sanctioned them a couple years ago. The UK sanctioned them. So I say that, like, from a sanctions perspective, I think they really are doing a pretty good job of targeting that illicit underbelly. And then FinCEN, I think is going to be a really key part of stablecoin legislation or market structure. And that is, like, you're going to be required to have Bank Secrecy Act type controls in place, compliance controls in place. And FinCEN will have an opportunity to do some rulemaking. I think it'll be interesting to see how much leeway they have. And to me, the more clear we can be in the legislation in terms of what is really expected. But one thing I think is, like, you hear crypto people say from time to time, like, no one knows what they're talking about in the government, or like there's no expertise, or we need to educate them. And I'd say, like, from my experience at Treasury, it's like there's a cadre of people at FinCEN, at OFAC, at TFFC, which is the policy shop, that are really true subject matter experts. We might not agree with everything that they do, but they're deep in this technology.
You mentioned Tornado Cash. What do you see the outcome of the Roman Storm case being? That's
a really interesting one. I don't know. I think that is definitely not what I'm going to speculate on. I will say that that DAG memo from DOJ makes pretty clear that we're not going after services anymore that are being used essentially to facilitate illicit activity. I think that the government probably has a very strong case based on sort of, like, I don't know. I have no inside baseball, so like email evidence or whatever it is that they're trying to tie these developers more closely. But I think it's very clear that Tornado Cash is a service, and if we're now going after, just bad actors, then we'd be going after North Korea, who, to be very clear, use Tornado Cash at scale to launder funds. But let's go after North Korea, not necessarily the services, and that seemed to be what the DAG memo, the Deputy Attorney General memo from DOJ was saying to do. So the answer is I don't know, but it feels like we're maybe not heading down that road. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I want to talk about that in the context of Tether. You brought it up. They're famously sort of compliant and compliant with law enforcement, but not necessarily on the, they're backed by something. In the new stablecoin legislation, we have proof of reserves as a feature there. Do you think that they're going to have the same role in the ecosystem here, or are they going to have to make some changes, or what do you think will happen there?
Yeah, I don't know enough about sort of like what their books to know like what they're going to have to do to get compliant, or if they are compliant today. So I would never like kind of go there to speculate there. I do think that any issuer of a US dollar-backed stablecoin should have US regulatory commitments and should be overseen by US regulators. When I was a prosecutor, one of our major jurisdictional hooks was correspondent banking. If you're a foreign bank, but you're using our financial system, then we essentially could assert jurisdiction over you. And I know it's a hot take, but I think that this is a hot take. But I do really believe that if you're taking advantage of the stability of the US dollar, whoever you are, and I think Tether has really leaned into compliance, has really leaned into investigations and enforcement, has come to the US and met with the president and done these roundtables. But I do think it's really important that you come within the regulatory perimeter, and every indication seems that that's something they want to do.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to keep eye on there, Ari. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
and I would be remiss if I didn't say this. Happy birthday, Gerald.
Happy birthday, Gerald.
So, we have to sing. So should we sing happy birthday?
On air, off air. I don't know. I think we'll save it for off air. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you to CoinDesk Live.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.